Slavery in America was not just an economic system. It was a system of power, domination, and dehumanization that touched every part of life. When we think of slavery, the image that comes to mind is often of white male slaveholders, brutal overseers, and enslaved black men and women working endless fields of cotton and tobacco. But there is a hidden truth, a part of history rarely spoken about, deliberately silenced, and largely erased. It is the story of white women in the Antebellum South, not as helpless bystanders, but as active participants in the system of slavery. Some were slave owners themselves. Many were abusers. And in the darkest corners of this history lies the untold story of the abuse of enslaved black men by white women. This is a story that challenges what we think we know about power, gender, and slavery in America. The word antebellum means before the war. In American history, it refers to the decades leading up to the Civil War, a time when the South's wealth was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. Cotton was king, and the plantation was its empire. White families lived in luxury, while enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset under unbearable conditions. In this society, white women of the planter class were raised from childhood to see enslaved people not as human beings, but as property. They were taught that owning and commanding black lives was natural. Little girls were sometimes given enslaved children as gifts, toys that breathed, children who became their human playthings. By the time these girls grew into women, they carried with them a culture of entitlement and domination. The plantation system was their world, and they too wielded power within it. Historians long portrayed white women as innocent victims of patriarchy, oppressed by their husbands, helpless in a violent world. But new research has shattered that myth. White women were not passive observers of slavery. They were active participants. They owned enslaved people in their own names. They bought, sold, and punished them. They managed plantations, controlled households, and reinforced racial hierarchies. Stephanie Jones Rogers, in her groundbreaking book, They Were Her Property, shows us that white women were deeply invested in slavery, financially, emotionally, and socially. And while white men's sexual abuse of enslaved women has been studied, far less is said about what white women did, particularly to enslaved black men. Yet testimonies, records, and survivor accounts reveal that white women, too, committed acts of violence, cruelty, and exploitation. One of the darkest, most hidden aspects of slavery was sexual exploitation. We know of white men forcing enslaved women into relationships, creating generations of children born into bondage. But what of white women? The subject is taboo, even today, yet enslaved men spoke of it. Historians uncovered patterns of abuse where white women, shielded by power and whiteness, coerced and assaulted enslaved men. The power imbalance was absolute. A black man could never consent. Refusal meant beatings, mutilation, or death. Accusations, even false ones, could lead to lynching or being sold away forever. For white women, this abuse was not only about desire. It was about domination, control, and asserting power over men who, by law, had no right to resist. These stories are rarely told, but they are part of the truth of slavery. In her 1861 memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs described the torments of enslaved women under white men. But hidden in her accounts were also observations of white women's cruelty. She recalled mistresses who beat enslaved women out of jealousy, wives who turned blind eyes to abuse but inflicted their own violence. Other narratives reveal enslaved men speaking of being targeted by white women, threatened into silence, forced into situations they could never escape. The voices of enslaved men are fewer, often silenced by fear. But the fragments we have remind us, abuse came not only from white masters, but also from white mistresses. White women also wielded another terrifying weapon, accusation. In a society obsessed with controlling black male sexuality, the mere word of a white woman could end a black man's life. Enslaved men lived under constant threat. A white woman who wanted compliance could whisper the word, rape, and that man could be whipped, castrated, or killed without trial. This power made silence the only option. Even when abuse happened, enslaved men could not speak of it, for speaking meant death. The system of slavery gave white women the ability to use both desire and fear as tools of domination. What drove this abuse? Historians suggest a mix of factors. White women were confined by strict gender roles. They were told their only roles were as wives, mothers, and keepers of the home. Many lived isolated lives on plantations, with little agency of their own. For some, enslaved men became a focus of their frustrations, their repression, and their need to assert power in a world where they themselves were controlled by white men. For others, it was simply entitlement, the same belief in racial superiority that justified slavery itself. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: enslaved black men stripped of dignity, autonomy, and humanity. Sexual abuse was only one form of cruelty. White women also engaged in brutal physical punishment. Records tell of women who whipped enslaved people themselves, sometimes with greater cruelty than men. There are stories of mistresses burning, starving, and mutilating the enslaved. The idea of the gentle Southern lady collapses when faced with testimony of those who lived under their control. The plantation household was not a sanctuary. For the enslaved, it was another battlefield of pain. In New Orleans, one name became infamous: Madame Delphine Lalaurie. Behind the walls of her mansion, enslaved people were tortured in ways too gruesome to fully imagine. When her secrets were exposed in 1834, the public was horrified. Lalaurie fled, escaping justice. But her legacy endures as one of the most grotesque examples of female brutality in slavery. While her cruelty was extreme, she was not alone. Across the South, countless women wielded violence and abuse, their names lost, their victims forgotten. The abuse enslaved men suffered left deep scars. Physical wounds healed, but the psychological trauma lingered. In a world where their voices were silenced, many carried their stories to the grave. The weight of abuse was compounded by erasure. For generations, the narrative of white women as pure, delicate, innocent reinforced silence. The truth was buried beneath myths. Only recently have historians begun piecing together this hidden history. Works like They Were Her Property reveal the economic, social, and abusive roles white women played in slavery. The WPA slave narratives, collected in the 1930s, include testimonies that hint at this abuse, fragments of truth left behind by survivors. Through these records, we see that white women were not powerless. They were active participants, and in many cases, perpetrators. The untold abuse of black male slaves by white women shatters the myths of history. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, race, and gender. This is not just about the past. It is about how history is remembered and how silence shapes understanding. By telling these stories, we honor the men who could not speak, the voices lost to fear and violence. And we remind ourselves that America's history is not one of innocence. It is a history of domination, but also of survival, resilience, and truth-telling. The future demands honesty, and honesty begins with remembering what has been erased.